In 1969, a man murdered an innocent couple and then calmly walked to a payphone, called the police, and said, "I want to report a double murder. If you run, you'll catch me." But they never did. And more than 50 years later, forensic experts are still asking, how was that even possible? San Francisco, 1968, a time of change, music, and late-night drives. On a dark stretch of Lake Herman Road, two teenagers sat in a parked car, talking about life and futures that would never arrive. They would dated Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. A single gunshot shattered the night. The couple never made it home. At first, the killing was treated like a terrible, isolated tragedy. No connection, no motive, no suspect. That single assumption that this was random and small was the first of many mistakes investigators would make over the next few years. 7 months later, on July 4th, 1969, the killer struck again at Blue Rock Springs. Darlene Ferrin was dead, and Michael Mageau was badly wounded but alive. From the wreckage came something disturbing, a phone call to the Vallejo police station. The voice calmly announced a double murder, and then, coldly, claimed responsibility for the earlier Lake Herman Road slayings. He called himself Zodiac. This was his announcement, and from that moment on, he wasn't just a murderer. He was a performer. He had moved the crime from the dark road into the spotlight. He wanted attention. He wanted a stage. But the attention came with consequences. It exposed the gaps in law enforcement. The Bay Area was jurisdictionally fragmented. Vallejo, Benicia, Napa, San Francisco, and those bureaucratic borders became the Zodiac's refuge. The killer struck across counties and moved faster than the cops could coordinate. Evidence that should have been centralized was kept in separate files, witness memory diluted across interviews. The task of stitching a pattern together was left partially done, and that is where Zodiac found room to breathe. There are two kinds of killers, the impulsive and the calculating. Zodiac belonged to the latter. He had planning, patience, and a capacity for manipulation. His early choices suggest experience. He selected isolated couples, nighttime settings, and carried himself with a confidence bordering on theatrical. These weren't random acts of rage. They were a show of control. He wanted to be the person who could walk into a small-town psyche and never leave. And he wanted the world to watch.
Lake Berryessa and Presidio Heights. Escalation and proof. He upped his ritual on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa. A picnic, a knife, a hood, and a symbol drawn in blood on a car door. This attack was not just violent, it was personal. The killer approached as if auditioning for a role, forced his victims into posture and performance, and then left a signature. He told them and left an inscription to the world. "This is my mark." 5 weeks later, Paul Stein, an ordinary taxi driver, was shot dead in Presidio Heights, San Francisco. The killer entered a bustling urban zone for the first time and executed a singular, brazen act. He removed the victim's car, partially cleaned the scene, and then sent a piece of the driver's shirt to the newspapers with a typed note. He supplied bloody proof. The act of mailing a piece of the victim demonstrated the same psychological drive as his killings, the need to manipulate narrative, to feed public fear, to prove he could reach even the hands of the law. Between Lake Berryessa and the Presidio Heights murder, the Zodiac transitioned. He went from shooting couples in secluded lots to plunging knives into picnic-goers. He moved from isolated killing to brazen murder in the public heart of San Francisco. This is the man who evolved deliberately. He wanted to control the story. Which victims, which headlines, which fear. The media, for its own part, obliged. Newspapers printed his letters. Radio repeated his claims. Public fear metastasized. People altered habits. Couples stopped parking alone. Late nights became riskier affairs. In response, the killer doubled down. He taunted, misdirected, and curated his image. Every press release and newsreel was part of his theater. Forensics at the time had limits. There were fingerprints, shoe impressions, blood smears, but no national DNA database. Handwriting analysis had turned into a kind of armchair science, suggestive but never definitive. The state's patchwork of investigative procedures allowed evidence to be interpreted differently in different offices. Zodiac used that sloppiness like a shield. And still more alarming for investigators was the realization that some of their best leads evaporated by chance. Witness descriptions conflicted. Patrols missed the killer leaving scenes, and simple human error, a misremembered face, an overlooked smudge, handed Zodiac the advantage. The killer was a patient predator, and the police were not yet patient enough to match him. 6. Letters, ciphers, and the psychology of an artist. Zodiac's letters were not a sideline, they were his signature work. He sent taunts to newspapers, ciphers, and boasts that knitted his crimes into an ideological manifesto of violence and control. The 408-character cipher, his first, was solved quickly by school teachers, not by the FBI. It read like a manifesto. It proclaimed motive as sport. He wrote, "I like killing people because it is so much fun," a line that exposed the essential pathology. He sought gratification, not revenge. He wanted recognition. The letters had structure, deliberate misspellings, odd punctuation, theatrical punctuation, and a rhythm. They were made to be read aloud on the airwaves, to drive calls into police stations, to make reporters sweat ink. Zodiac understood media mechanics. He baited editors with questions. "Print my cipher and I will stop," or "I will continue." That ultimatum forced newspapers into complicity. The ciphers themselves displayed sophistication. The later 340-character cipher resisted deciphering for 51 years until recent breakthroughs by amateur and academic teams employing modern computational methods. The 2020 and 2024 solutions, multiple analyses across the years, revealed not a name, but a mindset. Arrogance, religious delusion, and anticipation of public reaction. Solving the code felt like unmasking the killer, but in truth, it only peeled one layer of many. Beyond ciphers, Zodiac's letters included practical evidence, snippets of the crime scene, references to police actions, and details that matched internal knowledge. That specific knowledge elevated the credibility of the letters and made law enforcement publicly accountable. If newspapers printed the letters and the killer complied, the press would be implicated in facilitating his campaign. Psychologically, the writer toyed with identity. He varied his handwriting. He used different styles, different spelling conventions, and sometimes odd grammar that misled analysts. Was he attempting to confuse, or was he performing multiple identities? The deliberate variation undercuts the notion of a steady, single-profile offender. He might have been playing roles, a gift, maybe, from a background in theater, a military culture, or an occupation requiring varied personas. The letters also show a man who craved to be remembered. He sought an immortality of terror. He manufactured a legend deliberately and then shaped it with each new taunt.
Forensics, failures, and the lost trail. Forensics in the 1960s and early 70s was a nascent field compared to what we have today. There was no national DNA database. Evidence handling protocols were inconsistent. Laboratories worked with different standards. The Zodiac case came to highlight these deficiencies. First, evidence fragmentation. Each county collected and stored materials independently. Stamps, envelopes, a bloody shirt, knife remnants. Every item had a potential genetic fingerprint, but the chain of custody was not rigid across jurisdictions. People moved, files changed hands, evidence went into vaults and sometimes into basements where policies were imprecise. Second, contamination and misinterpretation. The postal system and press handlers handled his mail. Dozens of other people touched those envelopes before tests could be reliably run decades later. Initial biological testing produced partial DNA profiles, but those profiles were incomplete and often inconclusive. Later attempts to use genetic genealogy were hampered because the DNA profiles were insufficient, suspect names were withheld, and political or legal hesitations blocked wider testing. Third, human error. Witness accounts were inconsistent. Some described a middle-aged man, others a younger man. Descriptions of clothing and facial hair differed wildly. Eyewitness identification is notoriously unreliable. In Zodiac's case, it fractured the timeline and complicated suspect lists. Perhaps the most infamous error was a patrol-based miscommunication. An SFPD officer radioed a description that should have led to an arrest, but in the fog of tension, a suspect left the scene and wasn't detained. Fourth, interagency rivalry. Multiple departments, each protective of their turf, were loath to surrender evidence or coordinate fully. The task force that later formed had to untangle this web, and blood on shared carpets didn't help. Bad paperwork and bureaucratic pride allowed Zodiac to exploit gaps. He capitalized on procedural inertia, timing crimes to confuse investigators and slashing threads of forensic opportunity. Finally, modern investigators uncovered that some key items, like the so-called Stein shirt fragment, were handled in ways that raised doubts about their diagnostic value years later. The poor preservation, variable testing standards, and the passage of time turned potentially decisive clues into ambiguous artifacts. The killer benefited for decades, while science and procedure slowly caught up.
Suspects, new theories, and the case breakers. Over the decades, dozens of suspects rose and fell, some intrigued, others disappointed. A few persisted: Arthur Lee Allen, Lawrence Kane, Earl Van Best Jr., and, in modern discourse, Gary Francis Post, named by a self-styled group of case breakers who combined FOIA document trawling with family tree research and amateur forensics. Arthur Lee Allen was the early focus of investigators and the most famous suspect. He had motive, proximity,
and odd behavior, enigmatic comments, Zodiac memorabilia, and acquaintances who remembered his interest in violent fantasy. But physical evidence, later DNA testing and handwriting comparisons, would fail to provide conclusive links. Allen's case revealed something deeper. Even a suspect who fits, psychologically, can be exculpated by forensic gaps. Gary Francis Post, proposed by a coalition of former investigators, presents a modern twist. Post's physical scars resembled a police sketch. He had background links to military-like skill sets. Acquaintances alleged disturbing confessions. But institutional skepticism greeted these claims. Some police departments said the evidence was circumstantial. The FBI noted insufficient forensic proof. Post died in 2018, and that complicates any direct confirmation. Then there are the shadow suspects, men who match parts of the legend but never align with the whole. Each time new DNA, handwriting, or witness testimony arises, the list grows and then winnows. In recent years, private groups have claimed breakthroughs. They point to access issues. Why are some evidence caches sealed behind bureaucratic doors? Why is testing sometimes delayed? The answers are messy: legal red tape, institutional caution, and rare but real fears of contamination or misinterpretation. One of the most bitter modern frustrations is the case-breakers narrative. Civilian teams, some with former agency experience, claim to have identified a suspect through genealogical research and document correlation, but their attempts to secure authoritative testing of remaining DNA faced resistance. Agencies respond cautiously, sometimes citing incomplete DNA, chain of custody problems, or legal hurdles. The result? A tug of war between eager amateur detectives and risk-averse institutions.
Modern forensics, the 340 cipher, and what comes next. Conclusion and series tie-in. The 340-character cipher that eluded experts for half a century was finally cracked in stages by collaborative teams using modern computational linguistics and pattern recognition, a stunning academic feat. The content didn't provide a name, but did offer a window into an ego, an individual who believed in moral exception, paradoxical bravado, and a warped afterlife fantasy. Cracking the cipher did not end the case, but it re-energized public and scientific interest. Modern forensic tools, genetic genealogy, improved DNA sequencing, and cross-jurisdictional databases have solved cold cases previously deemed impossible. The Golden State Killer was arrested by genealogy analysis of familial matches. In Zodiac's case, forensic genealogy could theoretically apply the same technique if and only if the DNA is robust enough and political and legal barriers permit testing. That is the hinge on which the case still swings. Why then has the final door not been opened? Partly because the raw genetic material is often partial or degraded. Partly because mixing decades-old handling with modern sensitivity creates enormous legal and scientific liabilities. And partly because institutions, protective of their files and wary of false positives, move slowly. That bureaucratic slowness sits in stark contrast to the Zodiac's rapid and theatrical methods. Psychologically, Zodiac remains an archetype. He manipulated the media, law enforcement, and the public. He exploited poor interagency cooperation and the forensic weaknesses of his time. He wasn't just a killer, he was a teacher of crime theater, showing how systems falter when arrogance, attention-seeking, and horror combine.
As part of our series, which has already explored the Phantom of Heilbronn and the yogurt shop murders, this episode highlights the persistent theme. Forensics can fail when human systems fail. The Phantom fooled labs by contaminating swabs. The yogurt shop case saw coerced confessions and mishandled evidence. Zodiac exploited jurisdictional silence and procedural gaps. Each story is different but connected. A human error or oversight can multiply into a lifelong mystery. So what now? The case is still active in several agencies. Some investigators quietly say they are closer than ever. Others warn that we may never know. What's clear is this: a single DNA test, if it is possible, legally permissible, and scientifically reliable, could change everything. Until that moment, Zodiac remains both a historical villain and a forensic indictment. If this episode left you unsettled, ask yourself, are our institutions too slow to catch the modern monster? Should cold case evidence be prioritized for new testing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to follow this series, and keep watching. Our next episode will examine a dead man who had no name, the Somerton Man, and a coded clue that refuses to die.